Stanford University.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. By the way, please be sure to join us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNCKnowledge. Twitter.com/UNCKnowledge. A fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of economics at Stanford, Michael Boskin served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George H.W. Bush. A fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor at the Stanford Business School, Edward Lazier served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. Mike and Ed, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Peter.
Pleasure to be here.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 representing not a chance and 10 representing it'll happen for sure, how likely is it that the United States of America will become another Greece? Mike?
2 to 3.
Oh, really? I'm encouraged. Ed?
2.
2. Okay. Segment 1. Spending more than we bring in. A couple of statistics here. By January, President Obama will have increased the federal budget the federal deficit more in 2 years than President George W. Bush did in 8. He will have increased federal spending to more than 25% of our gross domestic product, the highest proportion in American history, with the exception of World War II. And he will have raised the annual deficit to some $1.4 trillion, more than 3 times the previous record set while you were chairman of the CEA in 2008. Ed, why does this matter?
Well, it matters for 2 reasons. First of all, right now we're talking about a very large deficit. And that tends to be the focus. When people in Washington talk about the budget, they tend to focus on the deficit. The deficit matters because it tells us how much we are borrowing, and since we save less than we invest, it means that we borrow from abroad. But more important, what we really need to be focused on is not the deficit, but the level of spending.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that even if we closed our deficit, and that would mean that we raised taxes, we would still be not helping the economy. Taxes hurt the economy, deficits hurt the economy. So once we've declared that we're going to spend at very high levels, we're really between a rock and a hard place. We don't have an easy way out.
Mike, let me quote to you Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman. This is Paul Krugman writing last year, quote, "Deficits saved the world. In fact, we would be better off if governments were willing to run even larger deficits over the next 2 years."
I think that's silly. First of all, there are 2 components to the deficit. One happens automatically in a recession. Receipts fall, especially because we have a very progressive income tax. They fall a lot. Some unemployment compensation goes up and some other transfer payments go up, but mostly taxes fall a lot more than income. So disposable income falls less than before tax income, and that helps cushion the economy. That was actually twice as large, maybe 3 times as large in effect as the discretionary stimulus. The discretionary stimulus, both the modest one in 2008, which President Bush and the Congress did in the spring, and President Obama's $862 billion
Billion, right, sorry.
$862 billion so-called stimulus bill passed in early February of 2009 helped the economy hardly at all. There was no big multiplier. If you plot consumer spending against when disposable income changed, there's very little effect.
Can I just ask,
very small effect.
This is not saying that the multiplier was mistaken sort of ex ante. The figures are in. You've looked at the data. This is sort of purely empirical now. It just didn't work.
Yeah,
is that fair?
I think it's fair to say you can't go back and rerun the economy.
Right, of course.
So you've got to suppose what the counterfactual was. Would the Federal Reserve have done exactly the same thing? What would consumers have done, et cetera? But in a wide array of sensible models, it turns out that multipliers turn out to be pretty small, and that the numbers that most serious economists work with are numbers between 0.5 and 1, not well over 1 as the administration has assumed. And they happen to be larger for tax cuts, especially those that tend to be longer lived, and especially those that tend to be on marginal rates, than for much of spending, a fact that was demonstrated in the research of Christy Romer, Obama's own economic advisor.
Okay, we'll return to her. Ed,
Let me just follow on that,
ahead.
because I think Mike makes a very important point, and one that I agree with. Probably the best evidence that we see from 2009 as far as the stimulus and its effect is that if you look at what caused the economy to turn around, and it did turn around in 2009, no doubt about it, in the first quarter of 2009, GDP fell by 6 percentage points. That's big. That's huge. In the fourth quarter, it rose by 6 percentage points. So that's a swing of 12 percentage points. Now, if you ask what caused the difference was all on the investment side. It was not on the consumption side. So investment fell off a cliff in the first quarter of 2009. Investment fell by 50%.
And we knew that at the time.
Oh, we knew it.
We knew that investment was dropping much more sharply than consumer spending.
That's right. And then after the fourth quarter of 2009, investment picked back up. Now, why is that? Well, I would argue that much of that had to do with the end of the cause of the recession. The cause of the recession was the financial crisis that occurred primarily in the autumn of 2008. Mm-hmm. We didn't know it at the time, but the financial crisis, the crisis per se, was probably over by the end of that quarter, by the end of autumn of 2008. That didn't mean that the financial markets had recovered. They surely hadn't. But in terms of crisis, in terms of the kinds of things that we were worried about back in September, those were gone.
Segment 2, money. From President Obama and the Obama administration and fiscal policy to Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and monetary policy. Financial crisis, autumn 2008. From that point, within a relatively few months, the Fed engaged in an unprecedented increase in the money supply. Here's the tightest statement of it I found. This is economist Arthur Laffer. Quote, the percentage increase in the monetary base is this is Art Laffer writing in 2009, is the largest increase in the past 50 years by a factor of 10. It is so far outside the realm of our prior experiential base that historical comparisons are rendered difficult, if not meaningless. Huge liquidity into the economy. And the Fed continues to keep rates so low that mortgages just drop below 5%. Is this the right thing?
Well, I would say two things on that. First, I think that Laffer's statement is a bit of an overstatement in the following sense. First, the Fed has a new instrument available to it, and that is the ability to pay interest on reserves. So a large fraction of the money that was printed is soaked back up into the system, into the Federal Reserve System. That said, I think that this is an issue more for the long run than it is for the short run. And the concern that I have is that when it comes time, and the Fed is already starting to unwind some of the programs that have started, mm-hmm. When it comes time for the Fed to unwind, there will be tremendous pressure on the Fed to avoid doing that, in large part because some of the things that it will have to unload, in particular the mortgage-backed securities, will have direct effects on politically very sensitive variables like mortgage interest rates. And so I think that's going to be the pressure in the future. Right now, it's pretty hard to argue that there is strong inflationary pressure in the short run. I think most of the evidence suggests that there isn't. But again, I think the concern is the long run, not the short run.
Mike?
I agree with that. I think we can break this up into 3 episodes. Part 1, some sizable, far from all, but some sizable fraction of the responsibility for the crisis comes from excessively loose monetary policy earlier in the last decade. The economy by 2003 was, in the middle of 2003, was growing at 4.5%. We had a recession in 2001, a slow recovery in 2002, then the economy started to boom. And the Fed kept its target short-term interest rate, the so-called Fed funds rate, below the rate of inflation for the next 3 years. So what we had was negative real short-term interest rates. So people could borrow $1 and pay it back in 98 cents later. So we had an immense
some
incentive.
Extent, the housing bubble is the
housing.
Fed.
It's not just housing. Housing bubble, low starter teaser rates on mortgages were enabled by this, home equity lines of credit, auto loans, credit cards and their receivables, private equity, all this stuff was financed. All of this was financed at the short end. People were borrowing short and lending long, making money as long as that continued, as long as strong growth continued and there was a steep yield curve with negative real interest rates or close to zero real interest rates at the short end. Then when that changed and people couldn't continue to borrow short term, that's when things really froze up. That's number one. So they deserve some of the responsibility for the crisis in the first place. That said, the response, lowering rates down to close to zero, and then I think you have to think of it as a series of experiments that they did because they weren't sure exactly what would happen. There was some history in the Depression and some history in Japan in their lost decade with so-called quantitative easing continuing to expand even though you couldn't lower interest rates anymore because they were close to zero or at zero. There was a series of experiments. I think some of them were beneficial, some not. I think it was unfortunate they started to buy long-term treasuries. I think that raises the specter of politicization of the Fed's activities in the future and being unable to unwind. So give them higher marks, good marks for the response, and then as Eddie said, the real issue is how they unwind. And that's a thing that has beguiled the Fed in the past when they've had to start raising rates early before unemployment got down a lot. There's a lot of pressure on them not to. I know that's Bernanke's intention, but we'll see what happens.
Could I ask you, all right, so layman that I am, I can construct an argument for either worry, inflation or deflation. So the argument for deflation, which you've already touched on, is that there's just so much money sloshing around, it's going to be very hard. The Fed knows how, as a technical matter, to scoop that excess money back, or what will become excess money, but it'll be under intense political pressure to do so slowly, to do so too. So inflation is a problem. On the other hand, mortgage rates are down below 5%. The housing industry is still lagging. Surely that has to be at least in part because people are expecting prices to drop even further. So you could argue, I think, that there are deflationary expectations already built into segments of the economy, and Bernanke is very correct to be worried about that.
I would say this is a short-run versus long-run phenomenon.
Oh,
and
it
again,
is.
And again, I think the major problem goes back to what you were talking about earlier. It has to do with our budgetary pressures. So remember where you started. You talked about the very large growth in deficits, the high increase in the debt to GDP ratio. We're talking about something over 70% by the time we hit 2013. Those kinds of numbers mean that the U.S. government will be spending in the very near future more on servicing its debt than it's spending on national defense. And the concern for us, I think, at that point becomes what do we do? Do we start raising taxes and raising taxes dramatically, or do we essentially default on the debt through higher inflation? The U.S. is never going to default on the debt. That's simply not in the picture.
Right, okay.
So the way we would do that would simply be to say, are we going to have a very high rate of inflation and a rate of inflation that essentially renders that debt worth much less to the creditors than it was in the past? And I think that's the big concern.
Segment 3, where we stand. Ed, you talked about the swing by the end of GDP dropped 6%. Give me the quarter, first quarter.
2009, first quarter 2009 to fourth quarter 2009.
And fourth quarter of 2009, it recovers by 6. So there's a 12% swing. All right. So
for a quarter.
Per quarter. This is
annual rate for a quarter.
Right.
Annual rate for okay.
The economy would have had to drop 6 percentage points for 4 quarters to have actually fallen 6%.
Right. Okay, got it. Thank you very much. That actually is quite important. All right. So again, layman's question. Since the end of the Second World War, the general rule seems to be the deeper the recession, the sharper the recovery, right? So, having just gone through the worst recession since the end of the Second World War, we ought to be feeling a rocket rumbling underneath this economy by now. Dow's monkeying around 10,000 and has for some months. May jobs report shows about 450,000 jobs created, but only 41,000 of those are in the private sector. The rest accounted for entirely by federal hiring. So what's going on? This is not a roaring economy. This is not a sharp recovery, is it?
Well, you have to distinguish GDP growth from labor market growth.
All right.
So GDP growth has been pretty strong in the past half a year. And in fact, when I left CEA at 2008, we had a forecast, and we said, what would it look like in early 2010? And we said 5%, and everybody thought that was ridiculous. Well, it turned out it's 4.5% over the past 6 months. Unfortunately, it's backwards. It was 6% in the fourth quarter of 2009, and then 3% in the first quarter of 2010. So that's not such a great sign. The problem has been that the labor market has not responded very quickly. And I don't think that any of the gimmicks, any of the so-called job creation techniques that the government has attempted to use have been effective. Unfortunately, we only know one way to create jobs, and that is to make sure that the economy grows and grows rapidly. The best prescription for that is keeping tax rates low and making sure that they stay low into the future. As you know, 2010 is a key year. It is the year during which many of the taxes that went into effect under President Bush, tax cuts, are going to expire. Capital gains, dividend reductions, as well as the highest marginal rate will most likely change. Those are impediments to investment, they're impediments to growth, and they're impediments to hiring.
Let me come back to this issue of the growth, because I think it's likely that when the recession is dated, it will be dated as having ended in the summer of 2009. If we date since then, 1 quarter earlier than the numbers Ed did, we've averaged 3% growth since the recession ended.
Which is
for
bad.
3/4. In the other two comparable large, deep recessions, 1974-5 and 1981-2, when the unemployment got up to 9% and 10.8%, higher than this time around, by the way, respectively, the economy grew between 5 and 6% for 3 years. So this is an anemic recovery. It's poor in job growth, and it's modest at best in GDP growth, in my opinion.
George Will, writing in June, quote, investors and employers, now I'm quoting, are uncertain about when interest rates will rise and by how much. That's a Ben Bernanke question, but now here's some Barack Obama questions. They do not know how badly the economy will be burdened by the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. They know the cost of Obamacare will be higher than advertised, but not how much higher. They do not know the potential costs of cap and trade. They do not know how the financial sector will be altered and impeded by the many new regulatory rules and agencies. If you're an employer or a venture cap, why would you hire people right now? I mean, so I guess what I'm probing for here is actually two questions. One question is, you both came of age and your studies, you were academics during this period, but how bad does what we went through, how bad is it by comparison with the late 70s, say? Is this just a repeat of a kind of cyclical something or other we ought to expect every 20, 30 years?
I think in terms of the effect on the economy, it's quite comparable to the late 70s and early 80s. I don't think this is any worse.
Okay.
I agree, actually.
However,
yeah,
I mean, you know, when you have 20 or 22% interest rates, when you have 10.8% unemployment, the difference is a new path was charted for economic policy in the early 1980s, which had lower taxes, more sensible and less regulation, and the like, okay? Lower inflation, better monetary policy, sounder money. So that's number one.
And Clinton, in effect, validated it, making it bipartisan, so there's real stability and certainty, right?
Well, yeah, we argued over a point or two of GDP and taxes and so on back and forth subsequently, but Clinton started from the center left and moved to the center. Obama started more from the far left, and we'll see if he moves to the center left.
A last question about how weak or how strong the economy is right now. One more reference to Arthur Laffer here, who argued in the Wall Street Journal in June, made the point that the tax cuts, all kinds of tax cuts, are set to expire on January 1st, and made the point that human beings respond to incentives, so individuals and enterprises are shifting, realizing as much income as they can this year to beat the tax hikes next year. There's income shifting going on, and in fact the economy looks better because of that than it's likely to. So here's the money quotation. When we pass, this is Art Laffer, when we pass the tax boundary of January 1st, 2011, my best guess is that the train goes off the tracks. If you thought deficits and unemployment have been bad lately, you ain't seen nothing yet. In other words, the economy looks stronger in some way today than it really is. Do you buy that?
Well, I buy it a little bit. Everything that he's talking about is anticipated. So this is not like something that's going to come as a big surprise to us. It's also a little bit difficult to substitute from the future to the present. It's not the case that people are working very hard today because they know their tax rates are going to go up in the future. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that that's the case. In fact, one of the things that is different in this recession and a bit in the previous recession, early 2001, is that the labor market has responded somewhat differently. The cut in the number of jobs is much more dramatic than it was in previous recessions. Productivity growth has remained high, which is unusual for recessions, at least historically. It used to be that during a recession, what would happen is labor would stay on, productivity would go down, and then as the recovery came on, productivity would increase. In this particular recession, unfortunately from workers' points of view, the layoffs, the amount of job cuts has been much more significant, and employers have gotten much more savvy about reducing their costs.
So saying productivity goes up and employment goes down is close to the same thing, right? Because productivity is just a measure of output per worker.
That's right.
To what extent is what we're watching a ratification of the technological revolution? Employers are using this moment to shift in technology and shift out human beings.
I don't think it's quite that. I think technology and people are complements, not substitutes. So as we look to the future, technology is not a bad thing for workers. Technology is a good thing for workers. The problem is the business cycle effect on workers. And unfortunately, this has been a period when we've seen very significant layoffs relative to the drop in GDP. So I agree with Mike. If you look back and you say, gee, is this the worst recession? You know, people always say this is the worst recession since the Great Depression. First of all, it's a lot different from the Great Depression. It may be the worst by some measures. It may not be the worst by others. If you looked at unemployment rates, the early 80s is a bit worse. But the point is, this is a very bad recession along the lines of the kinds that we've seen in the past. What's different is that the job picture, I think, is less promising as we move into the future, and that's unfortunate.
Segment 4, economics, a brief history of the profession. Mike, I'm going to quote you. This is you writing in 2008, shortly after Barack Obama defeated John McCain. Quote, quoting Michael Boskin, "Those of us who supported the other guy hope Mr. Obama succeeds." Very gracious. And now here's something even more gracious. "We like his top economic appointments." Close quote. Oh?
Yeah, I think they're capable economists. However, it turns out what seems to have happened in the Obama administration is that all the calls have been political, and there's been very little sound economics.
Okay, so here's what President Obama's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, your successor and your successor, Christina Romer, doctorate from MIT, taught at Princeton and Berkeley, director of President Obama's National Economic Council, Larry Summers, former president of Harvard University. These are serious people. What are they thinking?
Well, I would say, you know, I don't want to criticize the people who are in office right now. I think they're trying to do the best they can. This is, you know, as we all know, these are not easy jobs. I think they have a different view of the economy than Mike and I probably do. Larry is a terrific economist. He's a great person, and I think someone who is trying to help the economy, but he, to my
so
point of view,
he's,
well,
in other words,
I'm going to tell
okay,
you.
Go ahead.
From my point of view, I think he believes in Keynesian economics much more than I do. I think he believes that the stimulus works to a much greater extent than I do. Unfortunately, the stimulus doesn't work in large part, not only because the multiplier might be below 1, but also because it's very difficult to get the money out there. We learned that. I learned that directly from the tax rebates that we did in 2008. When we did those tax rebates, and by the way, the tax rebates are somewhat different from the stimulus because the tax rebates at least give the money back to the people. It's not additional spending,
right,
government spending. So there is a bit of a distinction there. But still, I have to confess in retrospect that when I look back at the evidence from that tax rebate, it was really underwhelming. The reality is we spent about $150 billion. We figure we got maybe a third to a half of that out into the economy over the first 6 months, and it had really very limited effects on economic growth. I think the same has been true during the Obama administration. Unfortunately, they didn't learn the lesson, I think, that they could have gotten from us. But they believe in what they're doing. I simply don't believe that it works.
Here, Mike, you spoke earlier about the 70s versus the 80s. Again, a layman's question. 1980s, you have in this country smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation, restrained, consistent monetary policy, growth. At the same time that central planning is bringing Russia and Eastern Europe into collapse. I had sort of thought that between Milton Friedman and George Stigler and Gary Beckler on the intellectual side and the actual lived experience of the 1980s and 1990s, your profession, economics, had gotten someplace. Conclusions had been reached. Now, am I simply mistaken about that? Did the Keynesian big government spending stimulus model simply continue? Did it just kind of go underground for a while and now it has sprung back forth? Is it considered still a coherent alternative model to free markets? Well, describe the intellectual landscape.
There is something called the new Keynesian view. If we go back intellectually, Milton Friedman and Franco Modigliani at Chicago and MIT at the time both geared people to longer-term time horizons. Bob Lucas geared us toward people's expectations of future events. And the supply-siders, myself and Feldstein academically, some others on a more popular basis, geared us toward incentives. And those things got incorporated into mainstream macroeconomics. But there was always, so the new Keynesians started to take a look at what happened when you did some of this, but you still had what they thought of as very sticky prices and wages, so the economy could get stuck and you might need a more activist government. So that's kind of been the on the intellectual side. But the leading new Keynesian theorist, Michael Woodford at Columbia, in his paper that he just gave in Atlanta in 2010, says that he can only get the multiplier up to 1 in extreme in extreme cases when the Fed's at zero interest rates and we're expected to stay there for the duration of when the spending is done. So I think intellectually it's kind of broken down. However, there is this political urge to do something, and that's very powerful. And I myself and most economists believe there's some short run where in an extreme environment Keynesian economics has some partial validity, but it's not large multipliers, but there's a very short time period.
So when it comes down to it, again, the layman's question, I watched the Obama administration. Clearly, there are intense political pressures. Clearly, Nancy Pelosi and Henry Waxman and the liberals who have ascended to the chairmanship of important committees in the House had a huge, but then there's Larry Summers and there's Christina. So overwhelmingly, it's politics. And you with your deep bow of professional courtesy to these folks, but what's really going on is they're trying to impose on what is essentially a political set of events some intellectual coherence and some is that right?
I think that's a little too strong. I would say that
you do too?
I think they partially agree.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it gets exaggerated in the political process.
Yeah, I think that the economics profession, despite the evidence that we have from macroeconomics over the past 30 to 40 years, decided in 2008 that we were going to believe the Keynesian model because we needed something to work. I think it was more hope than it was based on evidence. But unfortunately, that was what was going on not only in the administration, I think that was going on throughout most of the economics profession, and I hear it constantly. When I watch the business press, business news, many very distinguished economists will talk about the effect of the stimulus, how the economy has rebounded not only in the United States but in Europe in large part because of government action. China is another case in point. I just don't believe it. I don't think the evidence supports it.
Let me give you the best example of this, how outrageously exaggerated this is. President Obama often says something almost exactly like the following. It's largely because of the stimulus bill that we avoided a second Great Depression.
Right.
Okay. If you go back to Christy Romer and Jared Bernstein's analysis of the stimulus, they said for 3 quarters or so we were going to have 1 percentage point lower unemployment because of the stimulus. Okay. Now they thought it would top out at 8 rather than 9, and it actually got up to 10. So maybe it would have gone up to 11. But in any event. So that's nothing like, so their own estimate of the effect of it was tiny compared to this kind of effusive statement by the president and by many people in the political process. So that's what I mean by it gets exaggerated as it's told, and then it got kind of distorted in the political process to something that might have been somewhat effective, something that was fairly ineffective.
Okay, segment 5, where we go from here. Quotation, Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana. What we've seen in the past year, what I call shock and awe statism, has put the American experiment at risk. For the first time in my life, the country faces survival-level issues. Close quote. Melodramatic or accurate?
I think it's accurate. If we continue on this path, and this path means fiscal irresponsibility, very large increases in expenditures, not dealing with the entitlements problems that we have, Social Security and the Medicare and Medicaid being the most important, obviously. The new health bill is not going to bend the curve down. I don't think anybody believes that, even if you believe that
bend the curve of costs.
The costs.
Right.
I mean, even if you believed that this was budget deficit neutral, or even reduced the deficit, you have to remember that it's still an increase in spending of $500 billion. So it's only deficit neutral because it comes associated with very large tax increases. All of those things, I think, are prescriptions for an economy that's going to grow much less rapidly in the future. The problem is not just at the level of government. When the economy grows less rapidly, obviously that puts fiscal pressure on us because it's harder to balance the budget. It's much easier to create an environment where you stay with low deficits when the economy is growing. But the main thing is the standard of living. If you just look at individual standard of living and you ask where will our children be relative to where they could have been had we maintained the low tax, high growth, open economy policies that we had in the past, I think it's going to be quite different.
I think that we are at serious risk. We have wide swaths of the economy under state control and direction. And there's not been a clear exit strategy enunciated by this administration for many of them. I think that's deeply unfortunate. Even if they think they're going to take time, then lay out an exit strategy. It's going to take 18 months or something like that, but lay it out in tiers or something of that sort. I think that's a major, major problem. and they seem to be bullying every sector that tries to do something in the normal course of business. Now they're going after BP, insurance companies, et cetera. BP deserves some attention. They did some things that they probably shouldn't have, and certainly there's an ecological disaster, and they should be held accountable. On the other hand, we have the large fiscal issues, and so if you could think of, there's no worse time to be expanding the government than as we're heading into the baby boomers' retirement, and we're going to have the extra demographic pressures on top of the rising cost pressures in healthcare and the rising real benefits per beneficiary in Social Security.
Two basic remaining questions, only two. As a matter of pure economics, what should we do? And as a matter of practical politics, how can we get it done? So give me a nice, tight summary statement of what we ought to do.
I would say two things. One is we need to reform our tax code, and two, keep our taxes low. So when I say reform our tax code, there's an issue of what should be the appropriate kind of taxes that we have. We're far from the optimal tax structure. Mike spent much of his career studying taxes. I was on the president's tax panel before going to the government, and there are many things that we could do to reform that would be very beneficial to the economy. The second thing is keeping taxes low, and there's only one way to keep taxes low. You can't keep taxes low when you have spending high. If spending grows, there will be natural pressure to raise taxes to close the deficit gap, and that's going to be a reality. So what we have to do is we have to get control of our budget. I'll let Mike talk about the politics of it.
Well, let me just say that I generally agree with what Ed had to say. I think it's substantively much easier than they're letting on, because they've put in all these new programs, all this big expansion.
Right.
I think we should reverse much of that. I think that any change in the healthcare system should be narrowly targeted.
Right.
Okay. And I think our attention should be on controlling rising healthcare costs. In Social Security, we could index the initial benefits by prices rather than wages. Nobody's benefits would go down. Everybody's benefits would be at least the current real level of benefits, and that would solve all the Social Security's long-run problems. We should be getting much more rigorous in our evaluations of these programs, and the government should be scaling back. Partly for emergency reasons, we've got a whole slew of things, from education to infrastructure to a variety of other things that have been justified as if resources are free, and they're not.
At CEA, you're working in a White House, which means this is not pure economics. You're at least intensely aware of the surrounding politics. Let me put to you two strains of thought, all right? One is, noted by Mike writing in February, you write, Mr. Obama's programs increase the fraction of people getting money back from the government, more money back from the government than they pay in taxes, to almost 50%, just as the demographics on an aging population will drive it up further. Argument, we've already passed a tipping point. Roughly half or more than half of voters have already been turned, in effect, into clients of the federal government. And once that happens, as a political matter, you're not Europe yet, but as a political matter, it is really hard to reverse. Viewpoint one. Viewpoint two, Governor Haley Barbour of Mississippi, who was Republican national chairman in 1994, when Republicans recaptured the House, said this is the best moment, not long ago, for Republicans since 1994. Former Governor Jeb Bush of Florida said he senses that people would be willing actually to permit cuts in entitlements for the first time perhaps in his entire political career. Tea Party movement, the election of Scott Brown from Massachusetts. For the first time, first time in years, Gallup shows that more people call themselves Republicans than Democrats. So you've got this strange, coexisting strains of real pessimism about what's already happened in the country, with enormous hopefulness that there may be a decisive movement against the welfare state 70 years after the New Deal. How do you read it? How do you read the current situation, Ed?
Sorry.
Yeah, I see this.
No, I'll be happy.
When it comes to politics,
I'll be happy to give you my opinion.
You
Go
can
ahead.
start.
Go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's very dangerous for society to get into a position where more than half the voters get more back from the government than they pay in taxes.
That's real. That's a serious
That's
problem.
real. Some of that is a lot of the temporary stuff Obama did. So if we can end that, we'll get back down to around 40%. So I think we have a window, and that window is maybe the next few years, 5 or 10 years, if we can get this under control. If we then get well into the baby boomers' retirement, it's going to be very, very difficult to start curtailing Social Security and Medicare growth, not the levels, but the growth per beneficiary. So I think there's an opportunity. Second of all, I think people are aghast I think Obama badly misread the country. He thought this was an FDR moment, that everybody would move left because of the problem. They'd want and welcome this government with open arms. And people are aghast at the things that have been done, from the bailouts to the spending to the deficits. And they're very concerned for their future and their children's future. And I think that there's an opportunity to channel that into a constructive, more moderate, more modest, but much more effective government.
Sounds pretty chipper. Mike
Yeah,
sounds pretty...
I would say I'm even more optimistic than
really?
Mike. In the long run, I am. And I have a lot of
You're
faith
the opposite of the Keynes. In the long run, we'll all be dead. In the long run, things will work out. Huh?
I have a lot of faith in the American people to have long-term wisdom. And while people panic in the short run, there's no question that this was a period during which panic was rampant. I think that over the long haul, people will realize that the United States has been successful primarily for one reason, and that is that we encourage individual effort. We encourage people to go out, be entrepreneurs. We encourage people to find their own way, and we help them when they need help, but we don't do that to excess. I think people understand that's the right formula for the United States. I think people will push back in that direction. I hope that President Obama will, in the second half of his term, understand that in the same way that President Clinton did in his later years as president. I think that he moved, as Mike said earlier, President Clinton moved to the right, and he did so wisely because he understood not only the mood of the country, but he also understood that that was the way to successful economic growth.
Ed Lazier, Michael Boskin, thank you very much.
Pleasure, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge in the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.